Number 10. Kingpin's mutant prison. Some of the worst fates really do come from ruins, where it feels like everything is just awful for the sake of being awful, I guess. I mean, this series was made to sort of contrast the Marvels, and it does that admittedly, but it does that without really having anything else to say, it kind of feels like. When it comes to Quicksilver, he's seemingly still alive in this series, but honestly I can't imagine for much longer, which is how he's kind of making my list here. He ends up having his legs and arms removed because he's too fast, likely. However, Kingpin, his jailer, here claims that this is actually done for, and I quote, Quickie's own good. Considering that it looks like it wasn't done very well, and that it looks like Quicksilver may even still be bleeding, possibly bleeding out at this point, I can't imagine he'll last too much longer, and honestly, what a terrible way to go. Honestly, just existing in ruins I feel like is a pretty terrible way to go, because if you exist in that world, you're probably already dead, or you're like on your way to dying. I mean, even the protagonist, the narrator we follow on this journey, Phil Sheldon, is, so yeah. And he's like the protagonist, so, or at least the narrator. I would say he's still the protagonist. He's still kind of the character we follow. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, and if you love when we talk about pretty bleak things, be sure to let us know by clicking that like button. Number 9. Invisible Woman. Marvel Zombies really does have some of the most gruesome deaths, which is why I would never want to go there myself. This one at least was kind of going to a person that deserved it though, although I feel bad about saying that because I really do love this character, so like it's still sad that this happens in this reality. We are talking here about She-Hulk's death. I do love She-Hulk, although in this instance She-Hulk was already zombified and it kinda ate the kids of Susan Storm aka Invisible Woman and Reed Richards aka Mr. Fantastic in this universe, Valeria and Franklin. Weird thing is, you'd think Franklin would have been able to like fend her off with his reality warping powers, which I assumed he would also have in this universe, but hey, maybe on Earth 2149 Franklin didn't have powers, or you know, he was depowered prematurely. Either way, when Susan finds out that She-Hulk as a zombie has used her knowledge of the Baxter Building codes as someone who was once part of the Fantastic Four team to get in and then devour these two, she loses it and uses her power to create a force field and basically pop She-Hulk's head like a grape. It's insane to me how powerful Sue is. I mean, I guess at least it'd be quick, but yeah, Susan Storm's pretty wild. I would not want to be messed with by Susan Storm. Don't make her upset. Number 8. Driven mad by power. Another awful way to die, of course, coming to us from runes, is the fate of Silver Surfer. Silver Surfer dies as a result of what they believe to be a sort of superhero madness. In essence, it's believed that Silver Surfer missed the feeling of breathing air for some reason, being unable to as he was, you know, traveling in the vacuum of space without, of course, needing to breathe. However, this was the very time when he decided, hey, you know what? I'd love to breathe right now, even though there's no air around me. Not a great time considering, yeah, there's no oxygen there, you're just floating around in the space between stars and planets. However, Silver Surfer is believed to have basically torn himself apart, clawing at himself until his lungs were exposed, and of course, despite having the power cosmic, he died. It's believed he died from the shock of the cold. I mean, honestly, what a way to go. Become so crazed that you think tearing yourself apart so you can breathe while flying alone in outer space on a silver surfboard is a good idea, or is simply something you must do. I can't imagine that. Also, I love how it's like, I gotta breathe, like time to rip myself apart. Okay then. Number 7. Squip Grub Chulp. What does that mean? You're about to find out. Symbiotes are definitely some of the most frightening creatures we have in the Marvel Universe. Definitely would not want to be rescued by one. Sorry, Venom. But also would never want to be dubbed a criminal by one. For years, Venom had been threatening to eat people's brains, and guess what? It also became more than a threat at one point. Venom threatened to do this because the symbiote actually feeds on the happy chemicals that brains produce. So either it needs a host with a good supply of that, or one that basically snacks on chocolate a lot, which is why Eddie usually does that. Otherwise, it would literally have to find some brains to eat because it needs those chemicals, baby. Now, I'm pretty sure Venom has moved past this requirement in the modern day of comics right now, but it doesn't stop it from being a deeply disturbing thing that the symbiote did/needed to do to survive at one point. Also, for anyone who was wondering, the name of this point is the sounds that Venom made when, you know, scarfing down some brains. So, ugh. Number 6. Microwaved. This one makes me very uncomfortable, but I'm gonna tell you about it anyways because that's my job, so that's what I gotta do right now. Even though, of course, it's in a Deadpool story, which I think is the only place you could get away with something like this at Marvel Comics. In the comic Deadpool Kills Deadpool, we head to the multiverse where Deadpool, a version of Deadpool anyways, is hunting down, well, other Deadpools. Like the title says, Deadpool kills Deadpool. That's what's happening here. Right at the beginning of the series in issue number 1, the sinister black-suited Deadpool ends up confronting his alternate zombified self, Headpool, who is of course also known as Deadpool though, but we're gonna call him Headpool for clarity's sake. Headpool hails from the Marvel zombie universe of Earth 2149, where the world was ravaged by zombies. This zombie though ended up making his way to Earth 616 before he was reduced to just being a head. So how does the evil Deadpool deal with him? Pretty easily and terribly by popping him in a microwave. Splat!
Number 5. The U-Men. The mutants of the Marvel Universe have had a pretty rough go of it, being subjected to many atrocities due to the prejudices of the humans that despise them. Usually the humans are convinced that the mutants are dangerous and desire their extermination, so they can take their place as the next step in evolution, which makes the humans try to exterminate them first. Other comics explore how the mutant hate doesn't really make a lot of sense, as the humans will praise the superpowered beings until they find out that they're mutants, at which point they will turn against them. However, some of the humans hate the mutants out of sheer jealousy. For example, the Homo Perfectus movement, which are humans who believe that they are mutants stuck in human bodies and wish to undergo surgery to empower themselves with mutant powers. There was a cult-like faction of the group called the U-Men who swore against ever having contact with the impure world until they had had their powers, and wore containment suits until they could be transformed. The way the U-Men went about this was by traveling the country and capturing mutants who they would then harvest organs and body parts from in order to empower their members. Life for mutants is hard enough, but being captured by an insane cult with a military budget who want to dissect you and steal your body parts in a crazy quest to steal your powers is one of the worst, as it is a painful and demeaning way to go, as in the words of their leader, John Sublime, to them, mutants are just livestock.
Number 4. Daken. What's worse than being livestock? Being Daken's livestock, I guess. If Wolverine is the best at what he does, Daken is the one who simply enjoys what he does a little too much. Daken is a trained killer, and we get to see this side of him on full display during his fight against the Punisher during Dark Reign. It was during this era of Marvel that we saw Norman Osborn take over as leader of the Avengers after S.H.I.E.L.D. was no more, and he was basically put in charge of his very own organization, which he named HAMMER, an acronym that stands for, well, nothing really. Osborn just liked the sound of it. During this time, working for Osborn, the Dark Avengers were given a list of targets for them to remove, them to get rid of. One such person on that list was Frank Castle. This death is also what we'd call overkill. Daken not only tears Frank apart and runs him through with his claws multiple times, but in the end, he also removes his head. Of course, Frank wouldn't straight up die, but instead would later return as the undead Frankencastle, but regardless, I still think this would be a terrible way to go.
Number 3. Miss Arrow. When Spider-Man was killed by Morlun in the Others event, his body was put in a cocoon under the Brooklyn Bridge until he returned to life. He shed his skin, and this skin was taken over by a bunch of spiders, who formed a being called Arrow, who was intent on killing Spider-Man once and for all. Arrow began going by Miss Arrow, and she tried to impregnate Flash Thompson with an egg sac that would give birth to thousands of her offspring, but was stopped by a shotgun-wielding Betty Brant. Miss Arrow tried to escape, but Spider-Man pursued her, eventually managing to force her into the Central Park Zoo's aviary. The various exotic birds were thrilled with the group of spiders before them, and went about eating Miss Arrow one spider at a time as she thrashed and screamed. The birds ate almost every spider, leaving only one left, which Spider-Man promptly stepped on.
Number 2. Sabretooth. While Daken and the U-Men are both pretty terrible, if there was one person I wouldn't want to be killed by in the Marvel Universe, it would probably be Sabretooth. Victor Creed is probably one of the most vicious and evil characters we have in the Marvel Universe. Sure, he's done some heroic stuff before, mainly when his alignment was flipped or if we're talking about alternate realities, but this is a man who legitimately revels in violence usually. When he was sent to the pit in Krakoa as punishment, he used this time to kill all the X-Men and heroes he felt had ever slighted him. In his dreams, of course. This wasn't real, but it was still pretty brutal. And when that was done, he decided to create his own hell, and then plot his own escape, even double-crossing the prisoners that he had planned his escape with. Yeah, Creed has to be one of the worst ways to go, hands down.
Number 1. Deadpool's counter to the healing factor. On Earth 12,101, the X-Men grew tired of Deadpool's instability and insanity and had him committed to the Ravencroft Asylum, hoping that he would be cured of his madness. Unfortunately, his doctor was really a disguised psycho man who was using his position to try and brainwash insane people into doing his bidding. He took away the voices in Wade's head, but they were replaced by a new voice that was telling Deadpool to kill everyone. He became aware of his status as a fictional puppet and went on a killing spree of everyone in the Marvel Universe, both hero and villain alike. We get detailed accounts of how he kills the various characters in increasingly brutal and twisted ways, with some highlights being him taking out Thor by growing his hammer with Pym particles so that Thor is crushed underneath it, or trapping the X-Men in an insane death trap. But out of all the fates he subjects the various characters to, I think the worst is what he does to the characters with healing factors. Being a character with a powerful healing factor, Deadpool is uniquely qualified for taking out other such characters, and as Wolverine discovers when he walks into a trap, Deadpool has it all figured out. He has captured Daken and X-23 and left them suspended with a computer-controlled flamethrower. The computer keeps track of their vitals, and every time they come back to life and begin to regenerate, the flamethrowers go off and reduce them to skeletons again. So they are trapped in a continuous cycle of being burnt to death, barely coming back to life, and then immediately being burnt to death again, forever.
Number 10, Mark of Cain. Of the most gruesome ways to go, I think one of the worst would be to get Mark of Cain. Cain marked? I don't know if that's really how we say that, but sure. We can say it either of those ways for now, because I don't know what else to call that. Cain Parker is a clone of Peter Parker, of the two main clones we know from the Clone Saga. He was the one who was actually more dramatic and broody. He had long hair and for a while was more of an antagonist, or at least believed to be so. Cain was also known for straight up killing people that got in his way, with his Mark of Cain. What is the Mark of Cain? While initially we kind of thought it was like its own ability, it's actually just Peter's like little hooks that he has on his hands which allow him to stick to stuff, which we actually see in the Raimi-verse pretty close up. Cain would basically put his hand on someone's face and then turn on this sticky ability, which resulted in him seemingly burning the face of his victim. I mean, I don't know if this would actually kill you, but I feel like if this was at all involved in the process of Cain killing me, I would not be interested in that at all. Unless I guess I was already dead. Then I guess I'd kind of be fine with it, because I'd be like, well, I'm not here to feel that, so cool. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, why not show us you love us by clicking that subscribe? I know there's a lot of you out there that aren't subscribed, and if you're already subscribed, let me know in the comments.
Number 9, Man-Thing. In 1971, Marvel introduced Man-Thing. He was a scientist named Ted Sallis trying to create his own version of the super soldier serum before being attacked by criminals who wanted to steal his work. To keep the formula secret, Ted injected himself with the serum before getting in a car accident that caused his car to crash into a magic swamp. The serum and the magic caused him to transform into a big green swamp monster who was able to control plant life as well as a host of other abilities. One of his powers is to sense human emotion, with him having different reactions to different feelings. Fear sends Man-Thing into a fit of rage, and when he senses it, his body automatically secretes a corrosive acid-like agent that will burn anyone he touches. Hence the series tagline, "Whatever knows fear burns at the Man-Thing's touch." Now, I don't know about you, but if I came across a creature like Man-Thing, it would be difficult not to be afraid. So I really don't know how well I would do, and the idea of being grabbed by such a beast and burned to death because he's mad that I'm afraid sounds like a rough way to go.
Number 8, Torn to Shreds. This was a hard one to rank because while I feel like it would be really awful, I also still feel like there's somehow worse out there in the Marvel Universe waiting for me. Were I a person? Gosh, that would be terrible. I would hope that I was a superhero. That's the best I can hope, really. Still, this kind of death is pretty much as bad as it gets if we're speaking in general terms than, you know, straight up ranking it as one of the worst ways to die in the Marvel multiverse, which is kind of actually what we are doing here, but still, I digress. It's pretty bad. Deadpool is one of the folks who has undergone this usually life-ending process multiple times. One such time actually happened when he faced off against Carnage, who actually made a pretty dramatic appearance on our part 2 for this series. Of course, Carnage would take this approach to fighting and probably also immensely enjoy it, which it makes it, I think, that much worse. Now, because this is Deadpool, he didn't die here because Deadpool. However, this wasn't even where everything ended for Deadpool, because Carnage also was plotting to burn down the building that this happened in. So Deadpool would have in theory been diced and then kind of flambéed.
Number 7, Absorbed by the Hulk. One of the most feared figures in the Marvel Universe for both hero and villain alike is the Incredible Hulk. Despite his reputation as a giant raging green monster, the Hulk goes out of his way to not be responsible for the deaths of any of the civilians or villains that he has to fight while rampaging through the world. Despite this, it does happen from time to time. In the Ultimate Universe, the Hulk is known for eating people, which is of course a terrible way to go, and getting smashed by the Jade Giant would of course be a horrible experience, but I think the worst way that you could meet your end at the hands of the Hulk is the way featured in Immortal Hulk number 8. In this issue, the Hulk has been captured by a secretive Black Ops organization called Shadow Base. In order to prevent the Hulk from escaping, they have vivisected him into multiple pieces which they keep in separate jars, in order to prevent his healing factor from allowing him to come together and escape. The evil Dr. Clive, who is in charge of the program, is running various cruel experiments on the Hulk in order to fully understand the power of his healing factor. Little did Clive know, he was doing exactly what the Hulk wanted him to. He wanted Clive to run the experiments so that he could learn more about himself, and once he knew what he needed, he controlled his hand in one of the jars to snap its fingers, creating a shockwave that shattered the jars, allowing Hulk's various parts to reform and heal. Hulk took Dr. Clive's treatment personally, and as he reformed, he absorbed the Doctor into himself, causing the Doctor to be smothered by the Hulk's innards as he desperately begged for mercy that wasn't coming. It is a fitting end for such a character, but it's not a fate I would want to endure while living in the Marvel Universe.
Number 6. Ripped in half. Being ripped in half really does not seem fun, and yet for some reason this is a very common way to die when it comes to Marvel Comics. I can't count how many times someone has been ripped in half. I literally can't, because every time I attempt to, I actually think of another occurrence of this happening, and then I have to start all over again. So it's very hard for me to put a number on that one. It's terrible. Or, you know, maybe it's just comics. The one thing I'd really warn against, you know, if you're looking out from us at the Marvel Multiverse, is that while living in whatever world you are in, you should basically never do this to another person, be they villain or hero, regardless of your alignment or their alignment. Just don't do it. I've seen this kind of could basically come back to haunt characters who generally also get torn in half by someone else as some kind of like karmic payback. So if you've done it to someone, it's probably coming. Number 5. Steamrolled. Well, this one did not kill the person who was victim to it. It would kill most other people, and is still one of the worst ways I can think of to die that I've seen on display in the Marvel Universe. This death, not really a death, but you know, could be, comes to us from the pages of Punisher issue number 17, part of the Marvel Knights line, written by Garth Ennis. It seems oddly slow and terrible, a properly terrifying way to go. Yep, we're talking about when Punisher has Wolverine steamrolled. This also happens after Wolverine has already suffered a ton of other awful stuff, losing the skin on his face, getting shot point blank below the belt, and having suffered an attempt at removing his legs with a chainsaw. While he obviously lives past being steamrolled thanks to his healing factor, Wolverine has heightened senses, so he would also feel immense pain with every single inch that the steamroller rolls over him. And he actually goes feet first underneath it. Yikes. Number 4. Shatterproof glass. So this is one of those things where the actual story behind it makes it a heck of a lot worse, and also more poetic in some ways. Once again, we're going to Punisher Max, and once again, we're going to the same story that I was talking about earlier with the insidious operation that Punisher attempts to put a stop to, helping to free the women who find themselves basically trapped within it. However, not all the women involved in this operation are actually victims. One of them is actually a crucial part of running the business, and even suggests how to best break the women they are holding and using so they can be more easily used and manipulated, more malleable. When Frank runs into her, he knows her involvement and decides to dole out a pretty awful punishment: death by being tossed repeatedly into shatterproof glass, which eventually does give out, with the woman Vera falling to her doom. I think it's the moments in between being tossed against the glass brutally that really make me feel this is one of the worst ways to go. Those pauses in between, I'm like, oh, because you know what's coming and you have like no control. I don't like that. I don't like it. Number 3. Slowly consumed. Yeesh! This is probably one of the worst ones I've ever seen or read. I mean, all of these are really bad, but this one haunts me. This one haunts me to this day. When I think about it from a psychological perspective, well, I can't really fully do that because it just messes up my mind too much, so I can't really do it, but you get the idea. Basically, during Marvel Zombies, which happens in an alternate reality where most of the heroes and villains succumb to the virus, but not all of them, one of the people that manages to survive for a good long while is actually T'Challa, aka Black Panther. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that he gets out of the story unscathed, although he does not become a zombie for a very long time. At one point, he is lured into a trap and basically kept as a food source by Hank Pym, aka Ant-Man, or rather Giant Man, who prolongs his friend's death in order to keep the meat fresh, so that he might slowly consume him. Don't worry, Black Panther does manage to escape. He doesn't die this way, but not every single piece of him makes it. And there are others in Marvel Zombies, like Mary Jane and Aunt May, who actually do die by being consumed by someone they loved and trusted, Spider-Man. So, yeah. Number 2, stomach problems. Ugh. Okay, time to talk about Old Man Logan and his fight against Old Man Hulk. If you are familiar with the Old Man Logan universe and the stories that exist within it, I think you know where we're headed. For those of you who aren't, get ready and allow me to explain. Basically, in the Old Man Logan universe, the whole world is left in an apocalyptic state after the supervillains finally win and actually defeat the heroes. Success! Wolverine himself was manipulated into turning on his fellow X-Men by Mysterio, and now is only known as Logan. He doesn't like to go by Wolverine anymore, he doesn't like to think of that because it ended terribly. However, despite all of this and everything he has lived through, Logan still manages to find a way to keep moving and even ends up settling down and starting a family. However, he has to pay money to the Hulk gang, who basically have claimed the land that he and his family live on. Logan ventures out to get said money to basically pay his weird Hulk landlords and actually succeeds in collecting the money, but arrives home too late as the impatient Hulks returned early and actually murdered his kin. Seeking revenge, Logan challenges Pappy Banner, the head of the Hulk gang. Logan seems to lose the fight when Hulk eats him, but later on, Hulk dies of indigestion. That's what happens when you eat Wolverine. Number 1, Magneto. I think simply facing Magneto would be one of the worst ways to go. He is not a man I would ever want to come up against. I've seen him torment people by pulling all the metal out of their blood, pull off Wolverine's adamantium coating from his skeleton through his skin, and torment and kill a woman with a paperclip. And let's not forget that Magneto at his most skilled and powerful can actually just control blood flow in your body and your brain, basically taking control of your mind or just preventing oxygen from getting to your brain, thereby basically suffocating you in a really terrible way. He is basically one of the most frightening people that the Marvel Universe has to offer, and being killed by him for whatever offense he deems worthy of death, I imagine, would just be downright terrible, no matter what it was. Magneto isn't usually one known for doling out quick and painless punishments or deaths, so yeah.
Number 10. Trying to save the day and blowing your head off. Not all superhero teams are created equal. A prime example of this is Section 8, who are possibly the worst team on the DC roster. They have members such as Six Pack, who's just an alcoholic who attacks people with a broken beer bottle, Dog Welder, who welds the bodies of dead dogs to his enemies' faces, and perhaps most useless of all, Friendly Fire. Friendly Fire has the ability to shoot powerful energy blasts out of his hands that deal devastating damage. Unfortunately, as his name suggests, he is totally incapable of hitting what he's aiming at, and instead always ends up hitting his teammates. This has led to the deaths of a couple Section 8 members, but the worst death has got to be the one that occurred when the team went up against the mini-angled ones. These strange visitors attacked the team, easily dispatching team members like Jean de Baton and Dog Welder. Friendly Fire realized it was up to him, and he had to come through for his friends. As he put it, "I gotta do it. Just this once. Gotta hit what I'm aiming at. I can't let my buddies down. Must hold the power." He unleashed the full force of his blast and blew his own head off, barely being able to utter the word crap before dying. This is a bad death, but it also may be one of the most embarrassing ones you could possibly have. Number 9. Death by Psychic Squid. In Alan Moore's Watchmen, Earth is on the verge of atomic war with the doomsday clock ticking ever closer to the end of the world. In an effort to try and bring the world together with a common enemy, the smartest man on the planet, Ozymandias, puts a plan in motion to ensure a ceasefire between the states and the Soviets. He has a massive psychic squid engineered, and then he teleports it into the middle of New York City. It gives off a psychic pulse that causes the horrible deaths of half of the city. In the beginning of issue 12, we see the result of this, and the streets are littered with terrified looking bodies of people whose last moments were filled with nothing but pain and horror, having been declared acceptable losses in Ozymandias' unilaterally enacted plan to try and save the Earth. It's not the kind of end that anyone wants for themselves, and the cynical calculation of their lives being worth losing makes it even worse. In follow-up stories set in the Watchmen universe, which really shouldn't have been made, but whatever, we learn that this false flag alien attack was discovered by the general populace not long after, making all these deaths utterly meaningless. Number 8. Gorilla Grodd. Gorilla Grodd is a Flash villain who, as his name would suggest, is a gorilla. He is the king of a race of super intelligent gorillas who live in Gorilla City, and of course he hates humanity. He is a formidable foe, having telepathic powers that make him extremely dangerous. Beyond that, he's also a 600-pound gorilla. He is an extremely brutal character, and I don't really have much to say about him other than the fact that I think getting beaten to death by an angry 600-pound gorilla would be a really terrible way to die. Enough said. Number 7. Getting drained by Parasite. Rudy Jones was a relatively normal man until he won a tour of a LexCorp facility. While there, he dropped a donut on the floor and decided to eat it anyway, citing the 5-second rule. Unfortunately, the donut had landed in a bit of toxic waste and it affected Rudy, transforming him into a pink monster called the Parasite. The Parasite is always hungry and will do anything to try and satiate his hunger. When he goes up against Superman, he drains the Man of Steel's powers and grows stronger, but Superman isn't the only person he will go after. When the Parasite feeds on a normal civilian like you or me, he grabs them and drains their life force. This causes his victim to shrivel up and die, leaving nothing behind but a withered corpse. Now, coming across any supervillain would be a horrible experience, but being grabbed by a monster who painfully drains away the remaining life in your body as you watch yourself shrivel up until you finally die is not how I want to go. I want to die in a tragic hammock accident. Number 6. Joker Venom. If you were to live in Gotham City, the last person you would want to cross paths with is the Ace of Knaves, the Clown Prince of Crime, the Harlequin of Hate, the Joker. Joker is a total psycho who has absolutely no reverence for human life, often claiming his victims' lives in terrible and painful ways. He's had some brutal kills that were relatively one-off in method, like skinning a man alive in one book, but he typically saves these kinds of deaths for henchmen that have crossed him. If you are a normal civilian coming across Joker, your most likely cause of death will be either getting shot or being poisoned with Joker Venom. Joker Venom is a special chemical that Joker developed which causes the victim to go into uncontrollable spasms of laughter, which will cause asphyxiation. While this is happening, you would experience vivid hallucinations and madness as the muscles in your face contract into a horrible rictus grin, giving you a resemblance to the man who ended your life.
Number 5. Being dumb. Magneto in the Ultimate Universe was like the bad guy. He was nuts, and he had the power to back it up, which he proved when he used his abilities to offset the magnetic poles, which put the whole world into chaos. Tidal waves in New York, mega flash freezes in Latveria, volcanoes erupting in the Amazon, all that good stuff. Naturally, the survivors were not happy, and they would be coming after Magneto with a vengeance. They aren't dumb, so of course their attack on the villain would be planned out. Right? Well, it doesn't seem like it was. While all the surviving heroes make their assault on Magneto's fortress, the hot-headed Warren Worthington, you know, the guy whose only power is that he has wings, decides that he is going to jump the gun and come full speed blasting through a window, giving Magneto a good old punch to the face. Magneto could have squashed this guy like a bug in one swift move, but he doesn't even think Angel is worth the effort. Instead, he lets Sabretooth, his mad dog, do the deed. Sabretooth pounces on him, rips one of Warren's wings off with his mouth, and then stomps on the mutant's neck, taking him off the board in one page. Idiot.
And friends, before we move on to our next spot, if you love hearing about weird, dumb deaths, well, we have a lot of weird things for you on our weirdest playlist, so go check that out. It's full of weirdness. Number 4, waking up Fang Foom. Something you shouldn't ever do? Wake up a sleeping dragon, as Jerry Carpenter learned in Hulk vs. Fang Foom issue number 1, which admittedly is a pretty wild and weird story, so if you're into that, you should go check it out. Here, as promised, the two beings end up fighting, but first, we're treated to a story clearly inspired by John Carpenter's The Thing. Probably also why this guy's named Jerry Carpenter. You see what's happening here? Except Fang Foom is the shapeshifter in this tale. For those who don't know, Fang Foom is actually an alien whose race is actually known for their shapeshifting abilities. I feel like not a lot of people think about that, but that is a thing. Needless to say, Jerry finds Foom below the ice and sends for the rest of his team up in the Arctic. They're basically like a research team, but instead of just waiting, he is hasty to proceed because he basically wants to name this newfound finding of what he believes is an undiscovered type of dinosaur after himself. He smashes through the ice with a pick, only to awaken Foom. Foom blasts forth and takes Carpenter for his host, basically wearing him like a skin suit. The really weird thing though is I think this is the only case of Foom actually needing to do this. He claims he's attempting to rebuild his strength by merging with hosts and is looking for a real strong host when he runs into the Hulk, but I don't think he's ever actually needed to do that before or after this point ever again. And he can just shapeshift on his own. He doesn't actually need a human host to turn into a human, so there's a lot of weird stuff happening in this comic. But hey, if you gotta make Hulk and Foom fight, I guess you gotta do some weird stuff.
Number 3. Falling on Rogue. Nothing stands up to falling on a woman who leeches life away, unable to pick herself up. Well, falling isn't the right word. It was more like Mr. Sinister was held down. Following the events of M-Day, a mutant named Hope Summers is born, bringing hope to the mutant species. Well, Mr. Sinister, he reassembled the Marauders and planned to control the future of mutant kind by stealing Hope. Sinister knew this and wanted to use Hope to control the mutant population because the mutants can't just have something without a villain trying to mess it all up. Sinister regrouped his Marauders alongside Mystique, who knew that Hope was necessary to save her daughter, Rogue, from her out-of-control powers. Well, Sinister failed to capture Hope, and like an idiot, he informs Mystique that he is unable to help her save Rogue. Safe to say that Mystique doesn't appreciate that very much. She grabs and shoves Sinister's face onto the unconscious Rogue, and unable to get up, his life is sucked away. Now I'll admit, it's a little bit awesome, but in the massive gallery of villains losing their life, it's arguably one of the lamest ones. Imagine Sinister having to tell people about this one when he eventually returns. Embarrassing.
Number 2, turned into a sundae. I don't actually know if Ice Cream died here, but it certainly seems to be implied that he did. At least to me it does. This is the canon that lives in my mind. Ice Cream was a character who could turn into ice cream, hence his name. Ice Cream, get it? He infiltrated the X-Mansion in the first and only issue of Obnoxio the Clown. Speaking of weird comics, that's another one. He wanted revenge on the X-Men because they had cooler mutant powers than he did. Although how he really planned to get said revenge and beat them when his powers only allowed him to turn into ice cream, I'm not really sure. He attempted to turn the danger room on the students, but this plan ended up failing, with Professor X lowering the temperature of the control room to below freezing, which caused Ice Cream to freeze solid. At the end of the story, Obnoxio the Clown decorates Ice Cream as a giant sundae, while Ice Cream's fate is left ultimately undetermined. We never see him again, and it's possible that he literally could have met his end by being mistaken and consumed as actual ice cream at some point later in his life. So, yeah.
Number 1. Just take off the quiver. A lot of the time when a hero's light goes out, it will be in an ultimate display of self-sacrifice, throwing themselves into impossible circumstances in order to save the majority. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, that kind of thing. It's the number 1 heroic move, but it only really works when there is absolutely no other option. When looking at Hawkeye's sacrifice in Avengers Disassembled, there were a whole handful of other options, and most of them were pretty obvious, making for a heroic self-sacrifice that just ended up coming across as incredibly dumb and unnecessary. Basically, Wanda Maximoff has gone completely bonkers and turned on the Avengers, but none of them know that just yet. She's already caused the passing of both Vision and Scott Lang, Ant-Man, and all the Avengers have assembled in order to figure out what the heck was happening. Using her Hex powers, she created a Kree warship to show up out of nowhere and go on the attack. Hawkeye runs off to go get some more arrows, and when he comes back, he goes off, taking out Kree left, right, and center until he is hit in his explosive arrow quiver by an energy weapon. With his quiver on fire and set to explode, instead of just taking it off or firing off the arrows, Hawkeye grabs a Kree with a jetpack and blasts off into the warship, blowing both it and himself clean off the battlefield. Just silly.
Number 10, shot by a diamond bullet. This is actually a pretty smart way to deal with Emma Frost, but all in all a pretty dumb way for her to die when you kind of read it on paper. Both makes sense and doesn't make sense. I mean, Emma Frost has a diamond form, which makes her pretty much indestructible, for the most part anyways. So how does one defeat her when she's in her diamond form? Apparently by exposing the flaw in her diamond form and using the same material to kill her. How do you shatter a diamond? With another diamond, apparently. I don't know if that would actually work, but comic book science. Emma's diamond form is her secondary mutation, and while we've seen many attacks on her defended by this form of hers, apparently a diamond bullet can just insta-shatter her. I mean, I've heard of diamonds cutting diamonds, but never necessarily being used to completely shatter a diamond. If shot at her exact weak point though, apparently this is just what a diamond bullet can do, which is something one of the Cuckoos, Esme, knew about and exposed to kill Emma, mind-controlling mutant Angel Salvador to carry out the execution. Don't worry though, Jean, while merged with the Phoenix, managed to bring her back with Beast's help. Jean can do anything.
Number 9. Taken out by the Punisher. Some of the most creative forms of transportation to the afterlife come at the hands of Frank Castle, the Punisher. But at the end of the day, Frank is just one seriously messed up guy. A normal guy with a good chunk of training, a hell of an arsenal, and a little bit of creativity. He is not a match for a lot of the incredibly powerful beings out in Marvel Comics, but somehow we have the Punisher kills the Marvel Universe story. When his family were taken out by being bystanders of a superhero conflict, Frank is given the backing to take out all those who call themselves superheroes, and my god, a lot of these deaths make no sense, because of course they don't. He takes out the Hulk by waiting until he is Bruce Banner again, but that's never how the Hulk has worked in Marvel Comics. He took down Dr. Doom, with his only excuse for winning being that Doom stopped to give a speech, which does kind of make sense, but the worst example comes when he takes on the mutants. By the sheer will of lazy writing and Frank's throwaway explanation of manipulation, all the combined X teams are having their final battle against Magneto, Apocalypse, and their unholy alliance of acolytes and evil mutants on the moon in an air-sealed dome, which is where Frank drops a nuke on them, taking them all out. Ignore the fact that a good chunk of those here would be able to survive that kind of attack, and we're all good.
Number 8. EMP versus Phoenix Force. This has to be one of the most ridiculous ones. The Phoenix is typically known as being an unstoppable, undefeatable entity. I mean, the first time around, the only way that it was able to be defeated was basically by self-sacrifice. However, that hasn't stopped people from somehow banishing it or straight up killing the entity. Case in point, when Magneto defeated Jean Grey as the Phoenix by administering a powerful electromagnetic pulse, which gave her a planetary-sized stroke. Literally, those are the direct words from the comic. That is some major comic stuff right there. Only in comics would that happen.
Number 7. Being a part of X-Statix. Lots of deaths in X-Statix were stupid, but that was the point. The whole thing was a bit of a satire on reality TV. The team itself isn't exactly one of the premier mutant teams out in the world, and that's putting it lightly. The members of the team aren't exactly the most impressive. The original team made up of mutants Zeitgeist, who has the power of super puke, La Nuit, who has dark force powers, Battering Ram, who was a big purple goat-looking man, Plasm, who had liquidy water powers, Gin Genie, who could create earthquakes depending on how much she drank, and Sluck, who is basically a squid. They went by X-Force, which as you may know shares its name with a much more impressive team. But all those original members, minus 3 of them who I didn't mention, and Sluck, who was blown up by a tank in South Africa, all got completely decimated in spectacularly embarrassing fashion during a rescue mission to save a pop music boy band named Boys Are Us. Turns out their demise was actually planned by the team's manager, coach, and its leader, Zeitgeist himself, because they thought a team with a constantly changing roster and high body count would gain them fan interest. The team managed to go on with pretty horrible results. There have been 28 members of X-Statix who have passed away over their history, with only 9 of them surviving. So yeah, don't ever join this team.
Number 6. Eaten by birds. Miss Arrow has a pretty wild death in the comics. For those of you who are unfamiliar or haven't heard of her, that is probably because you know her by a different name, the Other. That is right, Miss Arrow is actually the extremely powerful spider totem entity that is linked to Peter Parker's Spider-Man. As such, she is entirely made up of spiders, despite sometimes appearing to be human while under the guise of Miss Arrow. Because of this, she was at one time killed by a bunch of birds who devoured the spiders that made her up, with Peter squishing the final spider that survived the bird attack. This wouldn't be the end of the Other though, as one more day messed up the whole continuity thanks to reality being warped, with Peter having actually never accepted the Other in this alternate, which is now the main, reality.
Number 5. Getting eaten. There are a lot of horrible ways to die while living in the DC universe. It seems like no matter where you go, whether it be Gotham, Metropolis, or Keystone City, every other day there is some kind of supervillain attack that is going to result in a massive loss of life until the local superhero manages to stop it. One of the surprisingly common things you would have to worry about as a civilian in the DC universe is how many of these supervillains want to eat you. Off the top of my head, there is Yurd the Unknown, who is one one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, but also a giant crocodile. He posed as a hero for a time to join the Black Marvel family before betraying the team and eating Black Adam's sidekick. That's right, that annoying kid who was following the Rock around in the Black Adam movie? Yeah, in the comics he gets eaten by a giant crocodile. And then there's King Shark, who is of course a massive humanoid shark who will often eat his prey. Then there's Killer Croc, who is a human who has a skin condition that makes him look like a crocodile, who is also known for eating people. Now, getting eaten by a monster would suck, but if you were eaten by a giant monster who was like a leviathan, then it would be over in like one bite. But these guys, although so large that you couldn't hope to fight back, aren't quite large enough to end your suffering in one chomp, and it would likely take a few very painful and very sharp bites before you bit the dust. Number 4. Turning into a dollatron. Another Gotham rogue you wouldn't want to come across is Laszlo Valentine, otherwise known as Professor Pig. Pig is trying to achieve human perfection by kidnapping people and turning them into mindless and identical minions who he calls dollatrons. The method of this is by burning a mask onto your face, which you could never remove, and then using surgical tools to put you through so much unimaginable pain that the trauma causes you to forget your identity and be simply a mindless doll who does Professor Pig's bidding. You may be thinking, oh, Andrew, they're not dead. Why are they on this list? Well, they have no trace of their prior identities remaining, and they have no thoughts or feelings of their own. For all intents and purposes, they're dead. And plus, it is not uncommon for Pig to send his dollatrons to their deaths for the cause. So if you want to be really specific, this entry could be getting turned into a dollatron who then blows themselves up. Number 3. Getting injected by the Scarecrow. Dr. Jonathan Crane is a Batman villain who has managed to come up with a chemical that causes those who ingest it to experience their greatest fears. When given the toxin in a gaseous form, the victim will have a really bad trip, seeing hallucinations that correspond with their fears. So if the person is scared of snakes, they will see that. However, Scarecrow also has a strain of his toxin which is much more powerful that he doesn't typically use. When the toxin is injected into the victim, they will experience the same unfathomable level of terror, slowly losing their minds until their heart eventually gives out, causing them to scare themselves to death. This is a rough way to go because you are dealing with the horror of being at the mercy of the Scarecrow, as well as the fear of death, and having to deal with your deepest, darkest fear at the same time. Ah, commitment! Number 2, getting captured by the Black Mask. When thinking about DC villains you wouldn't want to be stuck with, you might think the answer is Joker or Darkseid, but they, although cruel, usually dispatch their victims pretty quickly, all things considered. No, the villain you really have to hope you don't end up at the mercy of is Roman Sionis, aka the Black Mask. He is not above taking someone out with a simple headshot, but God help you if you come across him on a day where he has some time to kill. He is an expert at advanced interrogation techniques, being able to get even the most strong-willed person to talk after subjecting them to extreme pain, such as when he captured Spoiler near the end of the Batman War Games arc. Even if you don't have information he needs, you might end up in a sticky situation with the Mask, as he has a room designed exclusively for his horrible hobby where he practices on random people just for fun. So that would be a pretty bad way to die. Number 1. Prey of the Hunters 3. In Animal Man Volume 2, Animal Man is dealing with his daughter Maxine's new powers and her connection to the Red, force that connects all animal life in the universe. Animal Man has a strange map show up on his body, which will lead them to the Red, and he and his daughter set out to find it. Going after them are the villainous Hunters 3, who are essentially eldritch creatures from another dimension. They hide in plain sight by feeding on people that they come across. They slurp out your insides, leaving nothing but your skin, which they then get inside and walk around in. The disguise doesn't last very long before they look absolutely terrifying, with tentacles and pincers popping out of your now deformed skin. It's a rough way to go, and the knowledge that you are now a host to an evil creature who is desecrating your corpse makes it my pick for the worst way to die in the DC universe.
Number 10. Freshly hatched spiders. Yuck! This is one of the worst ones out there if you're asking me. It comes to us from one of my all-time favorite spooky Marvel stories, which is featured in Edge of Spider-Verse issue number 4, the previous Edge of Spider-Verse, not the newest one to come out. And the story that we're talking about here is that of Patton Parnell. I love Patton Parnell. Patton Parnell is an alternate version of Peter Parker who is basically a psychotic serial killer in the making. Once he is transformed by a radioactive spider bite, he gains more confidence and literally turns into a monster. He gets revenge on his Uncle Ted, who has mistreated him throughout the years, by placing spider eggs inside of him. Yikes! And, well, those eggs hatch. Uncle Ted isn't the only one who seemingly meets his end this way either. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, why not smash that subscribe button? I know there's some of you out there, some of you that aren't subscribed, probably not you folks that are commenting. I know you've probably subscribed, but you over there, yeah, you should subscribe. Number 9. Lights, Camera, Fire. I feel like so many of these are going to come from Punisher comics because honestly, it's one of the darkest characters we have over at Marvel, and he has also had his own Max series, which was basically all about living on the edge when it came to more graphic subject matter. So if you want some of the worst ways, that's where you're gonna go. You're gonna go to Punisher Max. Case in point, in issue number 30 of Punisher Max, when Frank is in the midst of hunting down those who own an operation that treats people as though they were mere objects. It's a thing I can't say on this platform, but I think you know what I'm talking about here. It's that kind of operation where you're treating people like they're not people. One of the worst things a person can do in terms of business, and one of the most powerful motivations in comics for heroes, or rather anti-heroes, to seriously mess up some bad guys, which is exactly what Frank does to the men involved who are stationed in America. And woman. The older man, Tiberiu, Punisher captures and lights up, recording his demise on film as a warning to be delivered to those in Moldova. Number 8. Strung up like a Christmas decoration. This is going to be an interesting one to try and describe here. Whew, I do not envy myself in this moment. This demise also comes from the Punisher Max issue. Same story, but an earlier issue. Here in issue 28 of the series, before he gets to the head of the operation, Frank deals with his son, Christu, attempting to get information from him on his father, Tiberiu, and their associate, Vera. He attempts to get him to talk by seemingly numbing him and using his organs as basically decorations for a tree. I don't know of Christu's fate, but I can't imagine it ended well for him, knowing how Frank usually deals with criminals. In fact, I'm pretty sure everyone has assumed, based on other things that are mentioned, or just in general based on Frank's nature, that Christu does not make it. Number 7. Crushed by tumors. Of course, when it comes to some of the worst ways to go, it doesn't get more gruesome and depressing than ruins. Every time I think I've escaped this alternate reality and my mind is free from it, there's always another list that brings me back to Marvel Ruins. In Marvel Ruins, one of the worst ways I've seen to go is the way of the Hulk. In this reality, superpowers are depicted as being brutally realistic, so when Bruce Banner becomes irradiated, instead of turning into, his giant, muscular, and vibrantly green alter ego, the Hulk, he just develops a bunch of green tumors that become so large that they basically crush him beneath their weight. Number 6. Death off panel, but then also cannibalism? Janet Van Dyne's death in the Ultimate Universe has to be one of the worst. First of all, we don't even show her enough respect to give her a death on panel, as she drowns during the tidal wave in Ultimatum, one of the many poor victims who die off panel despite deserving an on-death panel, especially considering Janet at the time was the leader of the Ultimates, so there's also that. But then, she also gets eaten by the Blob for some reason. It's also weird that they decided to make the Blob do this. I mean, the use of people eating people in Ultimates is just weird in general. I know the Blob is a bad guy as well, but he isn't typically known to be like a cannibal anywhere, ever. Feels like some weird and extremely gross sizeism to me. Number 5. Devoured by spiders. What a way to go. I just love spooky, scary Spider-Man stories. And this one comes from another tale based in the Spider-Man multiverse. We are talking about the fate of Spiders-Man. Spiders-Man is like Spider-Man, but this Peter Parker, instead of becoming a man with spider-like powers, basically became spiders. Peter Parker in this case fell into a vat of experimental spiders who devoured him completely. However, because science, they also ended up taking on his consciousness, which survived his physical death, with the spiders becoming kind of like a new version of that character. character, the hero Spider-Man, who is entirely made up of spiders, and who also kind of goes on to become a villain, but that's a story for another time. Now, I personally am not too bothered by spiders in my everyday life, but I also feel like I've never dealt with, a whole vat of hungry spiders who wanted to eat me. So on paper, this one remains pretty terrifying to me, even though I'm usually pretty cool with spiders. Number 4. The media revenge. On our part 1, we talked about the tragic and disrespectful death of Janet Van Dyne in the Ultimate Universe, aka the Wasp, but at least we can say she was avenged. Or we could say that if this avenging wasn't so terrible. I don't know if we can quite say that because it's pretty terrible what happens here. When Hank Pym, aka Giant Man, aka Ant-Man, finds out that not only is Janet dead, but that the Blob also desecrated her corpse by, eating her, he decides to get revenge by doing the same to Blob, but while he is still alive, because Ultimate Universe. Hank grows to his giant size and then picks Blob up and basically bites off his head. Although at least I guess he doesn't eat him, he instead, spits Blob's head out, but still the whole scene is not saved from being insanely awful, I'd say, and this is still not a way that I personally would want to go. Honestly, facing a giant being just seems like a bad way to go in general. I don't like that idea. I don't like things that are gigantic. It makes me uncomfortable. If you're not eaten, you're still likely getting squashed, and that's just a yikes to me. I don't want someone to step on me. That's no thank you. Number 3. Sinking with your best pal. Possibly one of the worst ways I can imagine going just in general. Whether we're talking about comic books or real life, this way is pretty bad. Even just based on the circumstances here, the way that Captain Kate Pride went is just really sad too. She went down with a ship, drowned, which many have said is actually one of the most painful ways to go. And what made her death even worse was that she believed one of her best friends, her pal Lockheed, also perished with her. This happened when Sebastian Shaw attempted to remove Kate from the Hellfire Trading Company, which she sat on the board of as their Red Queen, by, drowning her, killing her. Number 2. Starvation and isolation. This one comes to us from Magneto, who saw this as a fair punishment to dole out to Red Skull, based on his treatment of other humans during World War II when he was obviously allied with Germany in the Third Reich. Magneto in essence took Red Skull to an isolated underground bunker, leaving him trapped there without any way out as the door was locked and located on the roof of the bunker. Red Skull was left with no ladder and only some water to basically keep him company, which he'd have to ration in order to prolong his survival, although obviously I don't think Magneto really intended him to survive. During his time trapped here, he began to hallucinate and started to lose his mind as starvation set in. I think this is possibly one of the worst ways to go in general, so once again, Magneto takes one of our top spots. Basically, don't upset Magneto. Just don't do that. Number 1. Carnage. I'd like to thank Fireball Earth for this terrifying and very true suggestion, so thank you from the comments. This is such a good point. Carnage is so frightening. Carnage is definitely one of the worst ways to go in the Marvel Universe. With Carnage, you not only have to deal with having your life ended by a symbiote, which honestly, like I said, is terrifying enough, but you also have to deal with Cletus Cassidy, who is the other part of Carnage. Carnage is one entity made up of 2, serial killer Cletus Cassidy and his soulmate, the alien symbiote offspring of Venom, who we often name Carnage, but technically Carnage is the entity of both of them together. Anyways, this symbiote is actually Venom's first child, who quickly became known as one of the most cruel and deadly out there, largely due to their connection to Cletus. I've seen what Carnage does when he has a whole town full of people to play with in Carnage USA, when the villain took control of an entire town, and it is definitely not pretty. Hands down, it's one of the most frightening Carnage stories I've ever read, so I would not want to be part of that at all. No thank you.